Hi everyone, it's Henry here, and in this video I'm going to take you through a few different ways that you can paint up bone, tusks and horn on your gaming miniatures. This is some of my favourite stuff to paint, and I recently realised I had a couple of figures on the desk where this featured really heavily, so it felt like a great opportunity to cover that in a video. And this is kind of to sit alongside those other sort of technique toolbox type videos such as Rust, the various corrosion ones, the old gold we did a few weeks ago, where we just deep dive a little bit more onto an individual element of the model rather than try and paint the whole miniature. So I hope you enjoy. Let's paint. So as I say, bone is one of my absolute favourite things to paint on the miniature. I don't think it's particularly complicated. We're only going to use very few amount of paints to do it with. But one of the things I love about bone is all the different colours that you can get into it if you want to, and just that variety that's there, whether it's, old bone, whether it's been in, depending what environment it's been found in, what the colours are on it, that sort of thing. And I find it really helpful to look at some reference pictures. So if you're at all squeamish, I'm going to stick some photos up now to do with skeletons and stuff. And I just think it's fascinating, and I really do need to do some sort of undead project, I think, to scratch that itch. So let's have a look at the sort of colours that I'm going to want to use when I'm painting bone. Now, this is a variety of different brands of paints here. Some of them are out of stock, some of them you can't buy anymore. Some of them might be tricky to buy wherever you are, but hopefully what I'll try and cover in this video is why I'm choosing the paints I'm using, and you can then adjust to what you have available to you, or maybe try some new ones out if you're able to. But essentially the base colour, the darkest colour, is probably going to be some kind of greeny brown colour. I say again, depending on the environment or whatever that bone's been found. Maybe if you're doing something like a Tomb King's army, you might choose not to do like the dark greeny brown. You might choose to go for a sort of warmer, more orange brown colour as your base coat. But whatever you fancy. Let's say use some references. You don't have to copy stuff by any means. This is fantasy miniatures a lot of the time, so there's always that leeway. Just make what you think looks cool. But we kind of got that dark colour, then that mid-tone that we can really play around with, and that's how we can change that style, or the colour rather, of the bone that we're going to choose, and then a lighter colour, just for those final highlights. So I'm going to choose to use a dark green-brown colour for this bone on this model. It's kind of my favourite one to start from. My favourite one actually is this model colour, US Olive Drab. But generally, if it says Olive Drab, it's going to be a greeny brown colour. Here's a nice old paint, old Foundation range by Games Workshop, Charadon Granite. Again, a similar kind of colour. And if you haven't got any of them, just mix them up if you want to. Unless you're painting things like skeletons, often bone features, I think, quite frequently across miniatures, particularly in fantasy games. This is a really cool Orc Shaman model by Corvus Belli. This is for their skirmish game Warcrow. I did an Orc Warrior video on this a few weeks ago, and it was this guy that really made me think, oh, I'd love to do a bit more of a deep dive on bone, because I look at him and I get excited. Like, I like painting orcs anyway, but just this amount of bone and stuff on him, I knew that I was going to be quite fortunate. I was going to enjoy painting the model at every step. So I've chosen to give him a base coat of the olive drab, and it doesn't need to be perfect coverage. Just thin it down and get it on there and you're good to go. But as I say, this middle paint is often the one that can really have an impact on the sort of the tones that we end up with on our bone, because I'm going to mix it into the base coat to get a mid-tone with. I'm going to use it on its own, and I'm going to mix it in with our highlights. So it's going to be present in all the various stages of the paint job. And in the end, I decided to go with one called Gobi Brown here by Scale 75. And that's because that also still has some of that green in it. So we're really kind of doubling down on that. I'm always using a very thin, very dilute mix of the paint. That means I need to make sure that when I'm loading my brush, I take off the excess, so that when we paint it on, you see here on the palette, sorry, it's quite overexposed, isn't it? That it's really translucent, so we can see through it, so we can build those layers up. If we don't touch it off on a piece of tissue paper or something like that first, you're going to end up with too much on the brush, and it's either going to just run straight off the brush when you touch it to the model and be really annoying, or it will leave quite sort of thick, ridges as we move it around, simply because we're depositing so much of it in one area. Nothing to do with the thickness of it, but just the sheer volume that we're depositing. So I'm mixing in here. It's not 50-50. I'm just adding Gobi Brown into my base colour. So I'm adding my midtone into my shadow colour to create the first highlight. And rather than just painting it on and trying to cover the entire area, I'm doing tons and tons of little dashes and dots and scratches just to try and bring some sort of life into this bone. Quite luckily, this sculpt has a lot of that in it anyway, which is nice. But it's also great, I think, just to push that, sort of even further. And actually, the pieces on the shins and the forearms don't have a huge amount of texture on them. So adding it in here was great. The skull on his faceplate, tons of texture. But we're going to do this whole scheme without using a wash. We're just going to build it up with dilute layers of normal water-based acrylic paint. And I don't mind, as you see here, doing these little scritches and scratches and dashes and everything. I don't mind underneath that I'm leaving maybe even almost a little bit of pure black under there in certain areas. And then other areas are going to have black, but a bit of translucent olive drab over the top. And then another one's going to have this mix over the top. And for me, it just adds so much depth and interest into these bones, rather than perhaps that traditional way we may have seen bone painted, perhaps an heavy metal style by someone like Games Workshop, where it's, sort of solid coverage, sharp edge highlights. We're not trying to go for that here. So when it comes to highlighting, we're just looking at it going, okay, if the light's shining down on it from above and perhaps from a specific direction, where is that going to be lighter? Where is the light going to be? What are the shadows going to be that are created from that light? And we just paint those in. For the highlight, I'm going to use deck tan here. Again, you're looking at off-whites. It's going to change what it looks ultimately. I quite like deck tan because it's basically boring. It's not really going to change things too much. So all I end up doing is creating a lighter version of that Gobi Brown, which is exactly what I'm wanting. So that's the one that's really going to drive the tone that we get with the bone armor on this guy. And it's simply a case of mixing into the Gobi Brown and continuing doing the little dashes and the dots. This is why I said earlier, for me, it's not a complicated process. It's not a particularly difficult process. It just can be a little bit time consuming, but not that time consuming. I mean, this whole miniature took maybe, I don't know, an hour to do all of this with the filming, maybe 2 with all the filming and stopping and starting. So, comfortably a hobby session to get it done in. And then again, up around the skull, just thinking here, okay, the light's coming down, look at where it's hitting, just add more and more those dashes and scratches in. And one of the lovely things about painting in this way is if you do make a mistake, generally it doesn't matter. One little scratch in the wrong place, you're not going to notice it. Conversely, if you do want to really deliberately put a little scratch in, so for instance, I'm putting loads of these scratches in the area of highlight, I'm also going to put maybe 1 or 2 in that area of transition between this colour and the colour beneath it. And that can help start to create and smooth out, blend, if you will, these transitions without me needing to go in and do a load of glazing or anything like that. I just wanted to say a huge thank you to those of you that support us over on Patreon. Over on Patreon, you're getting other videos, usually from Andy, but sometimes from me over on Patreon. Tend to be more deep dive projects. At the moment, he's just started his new Golden Demon piece, which is covering the full process of from sculpt through to paint, through to also thoughts about the competition itself over on there. We've got some exclusive podcast stuff as well, but the support you guys give us over there enables us to do this full time, to create these videos for you, to do other things like MPO and, the podcast, I say, getting to events, covering events. So we really do appreciate the support. And if for any reason you can't support us over there, then your likes, your subscribes, your comments on here, hitting that notifications bell, it really does add up. We're only a little company, we're only a little channel, so anything like that makes a huge difference to us. So we really do appreciate it. And if you like this kind of more deep dive stuff, that's what we tend to get stuck into over on Patreon. We might spend 3, 4, 5 weeks painting up a miniature sometimes. And here I'm now just sort of going in and fettling, really. I'm going back to my various mixes, putting a bit more mid-tone in if I need to, putting a bit more highlights here and there if I've missed it, maybe even just going in and adding a bit more shadow to it. But hopefully you can see how quickly and how simply we've built up what I think looks like really interesting, old, gnarly old bone that this dude's made from his... from some various skeletons. Love the background on this guy as well. It's basically like when a boss orc gets a bit too old, basically, and is it's kind of silverback style with gorillas. But rather than sort of going off and disappearing, he kind of becomes like the wise advisor type orc. Also on this miniature, there are a bunch of these tusks coming over the top of his shoulders. This was a great opportunity to try a different recipe out, get something else on this model, even though it's all bone. So over the olive drab, in this case, I'm going to choose to use Karak Stone. So hasn't really got any of that green present that we had with the Gobi Brown, so straight away it should give us a very different tone. Very similar dilution of paint I'm using here, so remember, thin it down on your palette and then touch off the excess. And in this case, I'm going to paint, rather than loads of random dots and scratches all over the place, I'm going to try and follow the shapes of the tusks. So we try to create those, I'm sure there's a proper scientific name for it, but like the lines, the ridges that you get when you look at tusks or horns or whatever. Well, come to horns shortly, but particularly the tusks. And again, because the paint we are applying here is dilute, because it is thin, it's translucent, it's see-through, it means that all these little lines really do start to add up as we apply them. And because we're using nice thin paint, it's drying very quickly because we're not applying very much of it. So by the time I've finished doing the fourth or fifth tusk on his shoulder, the first one is ready for me to go back to and put the next highlight on. And all we do is just add more Karak Stone into the mix. But for the highlights here, so again, I'm not just following the whole shape, I'm not trying to do edge highlights on it, I'm thinking, right, these tusks are curved over his shoulders. If the light's coming down from above, where's going to be the brightest area? Well, it's going to be that point where it's sort of perpendicular to the light, which very helpfully tends to be around where his head is. So again, it's going to help create a nice focal point anyway, but also just trying to do that lighting slightly differently so we actually have, a source of light. And here we're going in with the pure Karak Stone, just what I was saying there. A bit out of focus, but hopefully it makes sense what I was saying. But I really like how you can see the different tones we've achieved here by using that different middle colour. And then for the tusks, I wanted to do something fun with the ends of them, and I quite like, brown into black, that kind of look. So again, I looked through the bag of brown paints. Thondia Brown's one of my favourite ones to use. This, you can see how much this stands out from the rest of the stuff on the model. We're moving towards warmer tones as well, so we're going to get that little bit of contrast too. But again, very, very few paints. What are we up to now? 4 different paints on the model, and I think we're already creating, a ton of interest. Now, if I was doing an entire army of guys like this, I would still do this exact process. For me, it's not laborious because I enjoy doing it, and I think the time you put in versus the results that you get out of it is actually still very, very good and very achievable for a high level sort of army paint job. Something like Warcrow, where it's a kind of skirmish level game, 10, 15-ish miniatures, what you're playing with, you absolutely have plenty of time to be sort of lavishing this amount of stuff onto, and then just start adding black and working towards the tips. But yeah, absolutely love it. So Horns gives us another great opportunity to play around with this sort of technique, but adding in a bunch of different colours, and an excuse for me to show you a bunch of sheep on the screen. The Games Workshop sent us through that Vizzik Skour Skaven model for review. There was no way I was going to get him completely painted up for a video, but I felt like the horns on him were such a brilliant sort of companion to what I wanted to do with the bone on the Warcrow guy that I thought I would add this into this video. So I'm base coating it using olive drab. If it's a huge area of horn like this, just use an airbrush if you've got one. I mean, I'm using our Cult of Paint Infinity here, so it's a 0.4mm needle and nozzle, spraying about 25 psi. Just thinning my olive brown down with olive drab rather down with just normal airbrush thinner, Vallejo in this case, and just get that base coat on there. I don't know whether a huge area of horn like this is easier or trickier to paint than a much smaller area, to be honest with you. I was going to be like, oh, painting a small area is way easier because the blends are much smaller and easier to do, but painting a large area was really fun. And by small, I mean his tiny little forehead horns rather than the big ones coming out sort of crown of his head. But the recipe I'm going to use for them is exactly the same as I've used for the tusks. So I'm just mixing the Karak Stone into the olive drab. And in a very similar way to tusks, I'm just following the lines of the bone on here. Now, there is a lot less texture on this model, but because it's such a large area, I'm able to go in and, and add it by painting a lot of it in. And goodness knows, I mean, this is sped up, this footage, but goodness knows how many little dashes I've painted. But again, individually, it's not complicated. I mean, we're doing this with a great big brush, you know, and it's, I think, really, really relaxing. And again, just going in and kind of ignoring the recesses, ignoring the edges, and just thinking, right, if the light's coming down from above, where's it hitting? Where is it lighting? And here we are still with just 2 paints working up to pure Karak Stone here. If you wanted to, you could mix in a little bit of that deck tan or something as well for a final highlight if you think it's worth doing. And I think it looks lovely just in that colour, but he's a manky old Skaven, right? So I wanted to give him manky horns. So let's see how we can go from the left here to the right side. I don't know which I prefer. Let me know in the comments. I do think they both look really, really nice. And what a lovely sculpt, I've got to say. And this is a nice simple assembly, so very easy to paint as a sub-assembly, which is great considering, you know, what a focal point it is of the miniature. So let's use, rather than just normal acrylic paints, let's use something like contrasts here to do some glazing and get some colours in. So I've just gone through my set and thought, okay, what are the sort of colours and tones that I want to pop on there? What will look manky? Again, greens will help. And I do these little sheets, little palette paper sheets, just to, because, you know, sometimes you'll get a pot out, and if it's not mixed properly, you're not quite sure what the colour is, and, you know, it's never right online. So just quick, easy reference sheet like that makes it much more efficient for me to grab the ones I want to do. But essentially, all I'm going to do is work up from the lightest colour. In this case, I think it was Plaguebearer. I used right through to the darkest colour. Now, I have thinned this contrast paint down with Larmian medium. If you want to know a little bit more about playing around with mediums and acrylic paints, I'll link up to a video I did a while back on a Dreadnought, where we do a bunch of weathering effects just using acrylics and some different mediums rather than, say, oil paints. And that's kind of a deep dive on that. And although it's a, you know, sci-fi vehicle, it's still applicable to what we're doing here. But we thinned it quite heavily with that Larmian medium. And as I say, once it's dry, we move up the horns, and then I start to add the darker colour. So I think it was either Skeleton Horde or Agharos Dunes. They were essentially the same when I was doing them like this, so it didn't really matter which one I was using. And I overlap the areas and then move on to the darker one, Garaghaks Sewer, and then move on to Wyldwood. And what I tended to do was put a couple of coats of the thinned colour on, move on to the next one, move on to the next one. I was letting it dry in between every coat. You might see some videos where people sort of wet blend with contrast and stuff. I don't really wet blend. That's not how I tend to paint. So that's why I haven't here. So I've just had a hairdryer, medium heat, low power, just to dry it off. You know, if it's high power, you'll blow it around, which you don't want to do. And the high heat can sometimes muck around with paint. But just did that, and then I'd move on to the next one. And then once every stage of that horn had a couple of layers of the colour on, I would go back and adjust if I thought certain areas needed to be stronger or not. I always prefer to do that rather than try and do it in a one shot and it'd be too strong. One of the downsides to contrast paint is the finish that it leaves you, partly because I don't think it looks very nice, but also it's not that easy to paint over the top of because it's a bit more shiny, so the paint doesn't key to it or grip to it quite so well. So all I'm doing to mitigate that is just popping a couple of very light coats of airbrush matte varnish over it. You can use a rattle can if you haven't got an airbrush, absolutely fine. Because now I want to go in and do a few more highlights. I like my models to look painted. So all I'm doing here is taking deck tan, so that fairly neutral highlight color, and then mixing it with the various contrasts at each stage, and then going in and just adding more and more of those little dash highlight lines in the areas where it corresponds with those contrast colors that I applied before I glazed over the top of. So when I'm saying glazing over the top, I'm just meaning putting a translucent layer of paint over the top to very slightly tint what's underneath. So it's an even thinner mix than, for instance, we were doing when we were building up the bone in the earlier part of the video. That was sort of quite dilute layers. This is, glazing is even more sort of dilute than that. And again, it's not taking a huge amount of time, particularly when this is, the focal point of your centerpiece miniature for your army. This is still, I would say, 2 hobby sessions at the very, very most. But if you just got in the groove, you're getting this done in an hour or 2 tops. Because again, it's nice and simple. Even though we've got more paints, to be honest with you, one of the most time-consuming things is just waiting for those layers to dry, waiting for those glazes to dry, rather. The contrast paint and the Lamy medium does sort of have a longer drying time than just normal acrylic paint that you've thinned down with water. But yeah, what beautiful, beautiful horns the sculpts on this really, really is. And I try my best not to leave too much of that sort of blotchy thing you can get when you apply washes or contrast. I think I've achieved it fairly well. There's a few here and there. And again, if I was painting the entire miniature for my army, I would go back and adjust those and make sure that paint didn't collect and pool in those areas to make sure I didn't get those blotches. So you've already been in and done all of that lovely work, almost like a pre-shade really, or a pre-highlight that we did with the initial recipe. So you can still see a lot of that texture that we've painted in. And we're just going in here and kind of sort of highlighting that, as it were. So here you have them. Two very different, or three really, very different recipes for some sort of takes on bone and tusks and horns. Not quite sure I'm doing a 360 of the vermin, the Skaven skull, because I didn't paint the back of the horns, as you've seen, because I didn't need to for the video. You just don't go up as high with the highlight, and you'll be absolutely fine on the underside of them. But also, I suspect on the model, most of that's probably hidden anyway. But yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this. I say this sort of tighter focus for a subject on a video. It's something I'd really like to do more often. I love doing that old gold. I love doing our old rust and third degree videos, and they were a long, long time ago. So I'd really like to try and add to that, let's say, that technique toolbox sort of library of bits and bobs that we're frequently going to come across. But what I would also say is, if you want to improve or play around or experiment with a particular thing like bone and stuff, then go and find some models that have a lot of it on. But I would say go and find some that have a lot of it on that you really like as well, so that even though you're almost kind of doing homework or practice, whatever you want to call it, you're still going to be doing it on a miniature that you like. And potentially, if it's a fairly small miniature, it might even be a miniature you finish, which is fantastic, right? Rather than just sitting in the box waiting until you're, quote unquote, ready to do it. And that's me speaking purely from personal experience and my feelings when I'm doing that sort of thing. And as I say, the Warcrow warband, particularly this guy, just really inspired me to dig out the sort of the bone schemes again and see where I was at with it all since I last sort of had a go. But if you've got any questions about anything I've done in the video, please pop them down in the comments and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Thanks ever so much for all of your support. Take care, and I'll see you next time. If you've liked any of the models in this video and you fancy having an army of them yourself, but perhaps you don't have the time or wherewithal to get it done, consider dropping us an email at commissions@cultofpaint.com and maybe Ben can sort you out.